All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about large bearing mounting. Now, not all of them are mounted the same, but we do want to talk specifically about some taper lock stuff. So let's get into that a little bit. So what I'm holding in my hand here is actually a spherical roller bearing. Okay, so it's a self-aligning roller bearing. As you can see here, there's actually rollers instead of the balls. And you can see here how I can kind of twist this out of alignment. And that's so, like, let's say we have a very large shaft, which this is, in my opinion, a large shaft. I wouldn't want to pick up a 6-foot section of this. And let's say that it's mounted to a few bearings on a surface, and those surfaces aren't perfect because it's a very big item. And there needs to be a little bit of grace for the alignment. This would be an appropriate bearing to use. That way that there can be a little bit of movement as far as off axis. And if we don't have that movement, then what can happen is that you can put a lot of stress in one particular spot and cause some premature failure of your bearing. So anyway, getting beyond that, let's take a look at a few mounting options. Now, one of the things that you may not be able to see in the camera, and even if you pick this bearing up, you're not going to see that the inside of this actually has a taper to it. Okay, and I can show you that it actually has a taper to it by telling you first that this particular journal here actually has a taper to it. Okay, so this journal, I'm going to move it into the camera a little bit better. It actually has a taper to it. So how I know that is, oh, wait a minute here, that thing doesn't fit on. Now let's go ahead and flip it over and put it over here. And look, that slides right up. Okay, now at this point, I would take a spanner nut, stick it on here, tighten the whole assembly up, and then you're good. Now, doesn't necessarily lend itself for a whole lot of flexibility. The bearing has to be right there. And so one of the ways that you can get around that is actually having a tapered sleeve. Now, this tapered sleeve is really neat. If you look at this very, very closely, you'll notice that it actually has a taper. It is larger here than it is over here. So this can go inside of the bearing, and then the nut will pull the sleeve in, and then forcing this sleeve to close up, and then thereby actually tightening down on this diameter. Okay. Now, the only thing you are going to need with this is you are going to need a key, which you can actually see maybe a little difficult, but there's a key that's on this shaft right here. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. So I'm going to take this, slide it over, put it over top of this key here. The key, again, as I'm torquing on this nut, is actually going to keep the assembly from spinning. Pop this off right here. I can take this and slide it over top of my shaft. I'm going to go ahead and put my locking ring on there. Okay. Normally, I would put a locking ring on. It's good for a thrust washer, along with actually having some tangs here to be able to mechanically lock in that particular nut so it doesn't back off and loosen up my assembly. Now, go ahead and run this up, and I'm going to run it up by hand, and let's see what that feels like. Okay, that's pretty tight there, but wait a minute, everything's still moving. Yeah, it's still moving because I have to put a good bit of torque on there to get that ring to actually close up and clamp on that shaft. All right, so how do I do that? Well, I'm going to do that through the use of a spanner wrench. Okay, not all spanner wrenches are created equal. These two here, this is a 16, this is an 18 to 20. What is that? Well, those are the sizes that you're going to need for these things here. Now this, you could probably get away with this one here. This looks a little bit on the big side. Maybe hard to see in the camera how that joins up, but as I'm putting pressure here, it's actually popping, kind of wants to lift that out. So this, I think, is a little bit on the big side. That radius is a little big, so I think this is the one that's closer. Quite frankly, it might even be a 17 if there was such a thing. But I'm going to use this spanner here, and I'm going to go ahead and start tightening this down. Now, it may take a little while. I can go ahead and check myself by pulling on the assembly, and obviously it's not tight yet. We're going to keep moving here. And all the while, what is happening is this nut is actually pulling the sleeve into the actual bearing, and the face of the nut is holding the bearing from moving, or forcing the bearing over the sleeve. Either way you want to take a look at it. But as I get, look at that, it's starting to get snug, and then I can go ahead and put a little extra torque on there. Now I'm not going to put a ton of torque because this isn't going to be a permanent installation. I'm just showing you this. But now I actually have this bearing here, and it won't slide back and forth on the shaft. And because these things are made precision, I know that the thickness is the same all the way around. Therefore, I have a concentric mount for my bearing. Right now, there's going to be a mounted bearing that I'm going to show you, a mounted housing that I'm going to show you here in a little bit in a different video, but it would use probably a very similar setup to something like this to grab onto the shaft. But So let's talk a little bit about taking this apart. Obviously, if we want to get this apart, we're going to do the exact opposite here. Trying not to tear my bearing up. Pull that back in line. Okay, and we're going to start backing this off. Now, this thing is jammed on a taper. When two tapers come together, you need something to pop them apart. This is the thing that I don't really like about this style, is there's nothing mechanically designed in to actually stop these things from, or to make these things separate. So we're gonna have to do some stuff. Okay, so I'm gonna back this off, give me plenty of room here. Notice that I can't, well, I did actually get this thing to move, which is a huge blessing. So if I can get this thing to move, then that means that I can actually get some other tools around it. Now, if I couldn't get it to move, I may want to get a brass punch or a steel punch and go on the back side here and just be on that inner race with the hammer and then go ahead and tap on that. Now, if I'm doing that, okay, what would happen is I'm taking the bearing and forcing it back off the sleeve, therefore allowing the sleeve to open back up and release the shaft. Now, if I can get this thing off, that is a fantastic deal. I can slide it towards the edge, maybe hold on to my bearing, maybe give this a few whacks here, right on the face. By doing the hitting on the face, I'm able to actually make those two tapers kind of pop apart. And you heard that snap. Basically what that was is that the bearing coming right off the taper. So that's a big plus. If these things have been on there for a while, or they've actually had a they've run for a while, they've been really torqued down, that may be a little bit more difficult thing to happen. Now, what I really want to talk about is this setup over here. Now, this is slightly different, but exactly the same concept. Okay, so I'm going to pull this spanner nut off first, get him out of the way. And now I'm going to pull this setup over here. And the first thing that you should notice is that this does have a taper, but now I already have a nut on here. What's that for? Why do I need it? Well, I'm going to show you why you would want it and why you need it. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to slide this thing onto the shaft. Okay, it still has a slot in here. And then we're going to force a nut directly on that race, and then we're going to shove it up against what's called a shoulder. So the bearing can't go any farther, and this thing's going to keep shoving in and then making it tighten down. The beauty is that after I loosen that nut free, I can take this nut, and while tightening it up, I'm actually going to be able to jack this sleeve out of the bearing. All right, so let's take a look at what it looks like. So I have my bearing here, and I'm going to slide that on. Go ahead and slide my sleeve on right up against the shoulder. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to see that there's a shoulder here, but trust me when I tell you that there's a shoulder here stopping everything. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take you on a little ride very quickly, and we're going to come down here and take a look at what's going on. Okay, and we're going to take a look right down here. All right, so as you can see, there's a shoulder here, and then we're going to take this nut right here, and we're going to run this on and it's going to come in contact with that sleeve, and then you'll notice here that I'm shoving the bearing and everything right up against that shoulder. Now the bearing is going to stop at that shoulder, or is going to stop at the shoulder, and then this nut is going to continue to drive that sleeve into the taper. Now I've gotten some contact right here. So now I've tightened that up. That bearing is not moving. Okay, now obviously I'm not going to be able to slide it off because this is here, but the bearing is not going to move in or out. Now, but the beauty of this whole setup here is that now I can take my spanner, sorry for the shaky, and I can back that off, and look, my bearing doesn't want to move. Okay, the bearing won't slide out at this point. But what I can do is take this, and with a little bit of force, this is sliding my sleeve right out from inside of the bearing so we can disconnect that. All right, so again, a couple little options right here for you to look at. We're going to look at mounting a bearing here in just a few moments.